All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. All right, so in this next set of lectures, we're going to start talking about some less general kind of trends, and we're going to dig into some much more specific topics. So in this case, we are going to be talking about parents and their role in faith transmission. Okay, so the first book that I want to talk about, when we're talking about the role of parents is this book, which is Almost Christian. So this is a 2010 book by Kenda Cressy Dean. And just a reminder who Dean is she is a researcher. She was part of the National Study of Youth and Religion along with Chris Smith. And she went and did some of the interviews in the New Jersey kind of area, right? She is a ordained Methodist minister, I think specifically focusing on youth ministry, and a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, which is a Presbyterian seminary which exists as part of Princeton University. So that's who Kenda Cressy Dean is, and this book, Almost Christian, comes out of the work of the National Study of Youth and Religion, principally the first phase of it. But what I think is interesting here, right, the book subtitle, What the Faith of Our Teenagers is Telling the American Church, right? And it was billed as kind of a wake-up call for the American church about just kind of what was going on with teenagers and teenage faith. So I think this is a profoundly interesting book. And because I think she's not a straight up sociologist, right? But she's working with sociological ideas. Dean, I think, comes at things a little bit from almost like an obtuse angle. And it renders, I think, some really interesting sort of insights about some of the National Study of Youth and Religion data. So here specifically, I do want to focus on her insights about parents and parenting. Okay, so one thing that's really consistent when we talk about the National Study of Youth and Religion and how it has sort of conceptualized youth faith is this, and this is the title of the chapter in Dean's book that I'm sort of thinking of, is Parents Matter Most, right? What is the number one predictor of youth religiosity? It's parental religiosity during the teen years. That's the strongest predictor of young people's faith in emerging adulthood, right? So it's super important, if you're going to have sort of the transmission of faith from one generation to another, it's super important, right, that basically we have that transmission happening in the teenage years, right? So what are some of the problems? Well, according to Dean, and this will be echoed by Christian Smith later on in books that he's written about, religious parenting, we have a lot of adults that lack confidence in articulating, much less teaching their own faith, right? I mean, you're talking now several generations that have grown up in sort of a post-Christian era where they're less suffused by, Christian ideas or ideas that are religious, right? And so they're less able to communicate religious ideas down to their children. They simply don't know how, right? They haven't, in a lot of cases, parents themselves were not effectively socialized religiously. And so to pass on religious ideas is something that almost they have to discover anew, right? Like, how do I do this? How would I pass down a religious idea to someone if I myself have absolutely no idea what religious ideas look like? And this is the sort of problem that we're faced with, for religious parents, ineffective religious socialization by, past generations has led to ineffective religious socialization. Now, some of this might have been made up for in past generations by having effective religious communities. But I think as we've sort of seen, right, religious communities themselves have kind of started to break down. Okay, so I think here declining stocks of religious knowledge play a role, right? So if you recall when we were talking about, Steve Bruce and Steve Bruce's ideas on religion as alien, one of the things that Bruce really contends is that, we have now declining stocks of knowledge, right? He says sort of anybody under 60, basically doesn't know the basic narrative of religion because they live in essentially a secular age, which isn't suffused by those religious metaphors in the same way. So, essentially, they lack religious knowledge, and there's less religious knowledge kind of circulating. So more falls on parents, right? Communities and the general culture isn't kind of transmitting religious messages in the way that it once did, and parents themselves have declining stocks of knowledge and have been ineffectively socialized religiously, making things a lot more difficult. And yeah, I mean, this is the phenomenon of what you might call differentiation, right? As people's lives have become less centered on religious communities, right? They're less involved. Religious communities do less stuff than they used to, right? They don't run the schools. They don't run all of these sorts of things. People's ability and religious communities' abilities to pass on those narratives have also declined. Okay, so the metaphor, for kind of religious parenting that Dean takes is one that focuses on faith essentially as a form of kind of bilingualism, right? And she takes this from a very famous sermon that was preached by a really famous theologian named Walter Brueggemann. And basically what she contends, kind of taking this idea from Brueggemann, is that the condition of late modernity, right, where we are now, right, the kind of later stages of modernity, some people call it post-modernity, others, I think more accurately say we're still in modernity, but we're now in late modernity. And what she basically says is that churches and other religious communities basically today have to be bilingual communities conversant in both the traditions of their religious communities, right, what she says, church, and narratives of the dominant culture, right? So in the same way as, say, if you moved here from a different part of the world, right, you grew up speaking Spanish or Arabic, and you come here, you need to learn, and your children need to learn to be conversant in, say, the language of the culture, right, of Canada or the United States or whatever, in a sense. And this metaphor gets picked up by a lot of people, things like we're strangers in a strange land, right? If you're a religious person is a stranger in a strange land, right? Where basically you're now sort of foreigners on the field of religion. And so you need this kind of bilingual ability, this ability to practice speaking a kind of religious language. Okay, so Brueggemann uses a biblical story, right? So basically from 2 Kings 18 to 19. So, the long and short of it is, in this story, Jerusalem has been surrounded by Assyrians, right, who are basically a people that in kind of recent history destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and shipped its people off to Assyria, never to return, right? So in the prior kind of period, if you don't know the kind of biblical stories, there had been a kingdom established, basically of Israel by the 12 tribes of Israel. And then at one point, because of poor governance, right, bad kings, it split into 2 kingdoms: the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah or Judea, right? And so there are 10 tribes in Israel, 2 tribes in Judea, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin in Judea. So what happens is, basically, for all sorts of reasons, the Bible sort of lays it out as they were unfaithful to God. The Assyrian Empire comes in and basically conquers that northern kingdom of Israel, and its people are taken away in bondage as slaves, and they disappear from history, right? They are assimilated into Assyrian culture as slaves, their religion disappears, and they are gone, never to return, right? There's no coming back from Assyria. They are dissolved into it, and Israel vanishes forever. Then the Assyrians come to Judea, right? And they surround Jerusalem, and basically it's pretty clear that Jerusalem is going to be conquered. They don't have the ability to resist. And so the city officials, right, are trying to negotiate essentially terms with the Assyrians, right? So on the wall, they have these conversations with the Assyrians in Aramaic, right? So they're outside speaking to the world, in a sense, outside in Aramaic. However, they turn around and they talk to each other in Hebrew, right? They talk about who they are as a people and about what Yahweh, right, about what God has done for them. And it's this, ability to speak another language, the language of faith, that ultimately, even though it looks hopeless, it looks like the Assyrians are going to conquer them and destroy Jerusalem and maybe take the people of Judah and Benjamin away as well, and dissolve them into, the acid bath of the Assyrian Empire, never to return. But they tell the stories of what God's done for them. They remember who they are as a people. They remember their relationship with God. And it's this ability to speak the language of faith and to speak in Hebrew about their own stories, who they are, and what their relationship with God is, that allows them to survive this Assyrian attack. They have to interface for Brueggemann with the wider world, right? They have to deal with it in its terms, right? So they're talking to the Assyrians in Aramaic, the language of the Assyrians, right? But they're also talking to each other in their own language. But the worldview they bring, changes how they interact with that outside world, right? They're interacting with it as Jews who are saturated in this particular story of faith. And it allows them to survive where the kingdom of Israel failed. Okay, so this is, I think, is the key quotation from Dean's chapter, right? And thinking of faith as a bilingual system. Okay, so I'll just read it out for you. Brueggemann maintains that taking part in both conversations is crucial for people of faith, and Christian formation must result in a bilingual consciousness. The controlling conversation, however, is the one behind the wall. Okay, my commentary here for a second, right? It's the one behind the wall. It's the religious conversation that has to be the controlling conversation. If we lose this language and its distinctive view of reality, there is nothing to do inside the wall but concede that the Assyrians' view of God and life is the true one. Without the behind-the-wall conversation, the language of empire prevails. Within the holy community, where everyone speaks the language of faith, our identity as God's people is reinforced. There we gain the tools that critique the dominant culture's view of reality, and that reminds us that we need not capitulate to the empire's demands. We know that the conversation on the wall is not the only conversation to be had. So I think this is really important, right? I think this is super interesting, this view of kind of faith is this bilingual language, and increasingly, right, in a post-religious era, right, where in the West we're post-Christian, very much so, right? There is this dominant narrative, and it's the Kardashians and Taylor Swift and Cardi B, God forbid Cardi B, but this is the language of the world, right? And it's a language that doesn't recognize a lot of the concepts that people of faith, that religious people sort of see as the dominant narrative, right? And basically what Brueggemann and Dean are saying is that if that distinctive language of faith gets lost, then essentially what you get is religious communities are dissolved into the culture, right? They cease to be relevant, right? Because they have nothing to offer. They have no alternative view of reality. They have no alternative view of reality. They have nothing to offer because, it's just a boring gathering on Sunday mornings that offers nothing, right? Because it doesn't speak in a way that's any different from the rest of the world, right? This is the language of empire, right? So, but within a holy community where everyone speaks the language of faith, there's an identity, right? There's a shared view of reality that's different from whatever view is perpetuated by, quote unquote, the world or empire or any of those sorts of things. So I think that deeply matters, right? I think that's a really interesting kind of way of thinking about faith. And it leads into kind of her concept of what religious parents have to do, right? That they have to teach their children the language of religion, right? Of faith, in ways that I think are interesting, compelling, and useful, and give them, the tools that critique the dominant culture's view of reality. If religious communities are going to survive in a broadly secular age, right? They need the tools that critique the dominant culture's view of reality. Otherwise, they dissolve. Now, is that necessarily popular? No, obviously not, right? Um, but there is a conversation to be had on the other side of the wall, right? On the inside of the walls for people of faith, Dean is saying there is another conversation to be had than just, about the Kardashians and all of these things. But it has to be in a language, and we're not talking about a literal language, but a metaphorical one, with different vocabulary, different categories that's able to speak to this particular view of reality. So what's really at stake for Dean with this metaphor, right, is the question of, in a sense, the survival of religious faith at all in a kind of post-Christian or post-religious secularized moment, right? And what she notes is that the culture has powerful forces of assimilation, right? Peers, popular culture, in particular, are these really powerful forces that are inexorably sort of drawing young people towards them, right? Towards whatever cultural narratives there are. And I mean, I think you're all probably familiar with this, right? You see Hollywood and kind of popular culture portraying certain values, right? And they're certainly not what anyone would consider, values that would be terribly familiar to religious people, right? It is values around, very loose notions of sexuality based mostly on consent, and very little else. Wide acceptance of, a number of behaviors. And, think what you will of LGBTQ questions of contraception, abortion, anything that you can really think of, right? Whether it even wealth acquisition, things that are kind of broadly out of sync with traditional views that we find in religious communities, right? The culture is very much kind of prioritizing away from these things and carrying very different messages, right? And think of how the culture, just in your own experiences, kind of suggests that you should be happy, right? This is a very different story than, say, Christianity or Islam or Buddhism would ultimately give, right? It's a story of, self-indulgence, self-discovery, and embracing, physical and worldly pleasures. Whereas, most major religions sort of see those things as part of life, but ultimately not sort of the highest purpose of life. So, we're moving away from, a time where Christianity is dominant in the West. I mean, the rest of the world is lagging behind, I think, in terms of secularization, but it may get there at some point. And I mean, what's really at stake for Dean, right, is this question of whether with Christians and other religious people can continue to have a distinct worldview within this kind of post-religious context. And here, this metaphor that Dean's been proffering from this Walter Brueggemann sermon is, I think, kind of interesting, right? The people of Israel, right, that northern Jewish kingdom, were assimilated by the Assyrians, right? And I've got my, if you're not familiar with Star Trek, right, one of the enemies in Star Trek is the Borg, right? And the Borg go and they assimilate other species and they make them just like themselves. And this is essentially what Dean's saying. Like, this is the two kind of paths before religious people is the path of the kingdom of Israel, right? That was assimilated by the Assyrians and disappeared from history because they weren't able to hold themselves apart and tell their own story. Versus the people of Judah, that southern Jewish kingdom that survived that Assyrian assault, but also later was conquered by multiple kingdoms, right? The Babylonians came and conquered the kingdom of Judea, and took basically the Judeans away from Jerusalem and from the Holy Land for 60 years. Brought them back to around where modern day Baghdad is. So in the year 597 BC, Basically, the Babylonians hauled away a good part of the Jews that were living in Judea, and took them to Babylon as slaves and servants. And they wouldn't return, back to their country of origin until 538 BC. So, fundamentally, they survived this, right? There's enough cultural distinction in this kingdom, and they're faced with powerful external cultural assimilation, right? It would have been very easy for them to give in to the Assyrians. It would have been very easy for them to give in to the Babylonians. And yet they had this kind of internal narrative about who they were that kept them a people and kept them from being assimilated. Um, and I mean, assimilation is a powerful force, right? In modern cultures, that pop culture force is a really powerful one, drawing people away from religious traditions and from all sorts of traditions, right? Even in terms of language, right? Most people coming from Canada or to Canada from other places will learn or will lose the language of their country of origin within a few generations, right? And we now see efforts that people have made, to start Ukrainian and German and other schools to regain those languages, right? And Mandarin schools and all sorts of things to regain those languages essentially that were lost through the process of assimilation. So there are powerful forces of assimilation, and the future of kind of religion, according to Dean, can religious people set themselves apart and have stories and narratives and ways of speaking internally, that allow them to maintain that high level of distinction and not be dissolved into the culture. So one of the other points that Dean talks about, as a really kind of an inflection point, is around the term catechesis, right? And she thinks this is a very, very important term. And essentially, um, catechesis is that translation and that passing on of faith from one generation to another. Okay, so basically, catechesis is this term created essentially by Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer. And she thinks this is a key inflection point. And basically, Luther looking at the world, and seeing, as I think a lot of Christians have over the centuries, that given the importance of what they saw as the message of the faith, that it wasn't being passed on very effectively, right? There was poor Christian formation. People really didn't know, much about the faith. So, basically he suggested, and his kind of model was a move towards an in-home parent-led sort of formation, typically guided by fathers, right? Obviously in a more patriarchal society, fathers would have the primacy of being the teachers over mothers. Now, some of this gets taken over by professionals later on, right? You get the advent of, the Sunday school and catechesis classes done by adults for children, right? And ostensibly this is done, by professionals. And, at a certain point, we see that it sort of gets passed into official school settings, right? And I mean, even if you think about, Catholicism, obviously we have Catholic schools in Alberta and in Canada, and there's a long history of parochial, so non-state funded Catholic schools in the United States, right? They're still around. And then, the public school system in Canada until relatively recently used to be a very Protestant thing, right? It taught, some pretty basic Protestant values. And it's only recently that that's really changed. I think one of the things that Dean suggests, which I think is quite correct, is that schools are good at a lot of things, right? They're good at a lot of things. But passing on faith doesn't seem to be one of them, right? There's too many competing priorities. The focus of schools is really on information delivery and skills building, right? And so communicating, a narrative of faith, and especially like trying to communicate the language of faith, is something that school, and in a non-personal setting where the person teaching you, may be someone that you have only a tangential relationship with, their credentials, I'm certainly thinking of kind of Catholic school in Alberta, right? The credentials of people teaching religion classes is hardly evident from a lot of the things that they teach. And, I hear plenty of horror stories, from people who have been taught incorrect things in Catholic schools. things that, it doesn't take a degree in theology to realize are not based in Catholicism, but based on the quirks that this particular teacher has. Um, so passing on faith doesn't seem to be something that they're good at. I mean, schools, especially as we enter kind of the post-industrial and late modern period, they're being asked to do a lot of things, right? And I mean, my wife works in a school as a inclusive learning teacher, and she basically does the work of a social worker and a special needs teacher and a whole bunch of other jobs all at the same time. There's simply too many things we're asking schools to do right now for them to be really effective in this this task of passing on the faith. They may have been good at it at one time, but that doesn't seem to be the time we live in. Okay, so the data from the National Study of Youth and Religion, for Dean is troubling, especially as it has to do with young Christians. And according to her, right, the behind the wall conversations, those moments where parents would be passing on religious vocabulary to their children, is not being done with enough fervor and frequency to keep young Christians from being assimilated into late modern culture. Right? It simply isn't. And this instinct to where parents feel under-equipped, right? And I don't think there's any question of this, right? That having, I think, been ineffectively religiously socialized themselves, there's a lot of parents, religious parents, that probably feel very under-equipped to pass on religious faith. So the temptation, right, is to, well, what's the most efficient way to do this? What would be the most efficient way to get, faith passed on to children? Well, it's to turn to some kind of religious experts for religious education, right? Whether that be, in Sunday school or some other kind of youth program within a religious community, religious schools, right? Whether they be Catholic, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, right? To turn it over to religious experts. Now, I think this is an understandable kind of impulse. Certainly in the West, we're used to thinking of people in terms of a lot of different levels of expertise. And we want to think that, turning to experts is going to be the best path. But when it comes to passing on religious faith, it doesn't make much sense, sociologically or theologically, to sort of farm everything over to religious communities, right? Because, it is in the home that these conversations are most effectively had. Okay, so what she's ultimately emphasizing, I think, is that what the sociological data suggests about the best model for passing on faith and the model that most religious congregations use are at odds with each other, right? That we go for the specialist education rather than the parental one, and that is fundamentally kind of a problem. Um, so, I mean, what does faith really look like, right? What does the building of faith really look like in the end? Well, it ends up looking much more relational than informational. So what brings people to faith, what keeps people in faith, is not so much about belief, right? It's not so much about transmitting the right information to people, or convincing them with some great argument, right? It is relational. And I mean, this is really consistent with the sociology of religion literature. So what do we know? Um, Basically, the way that religious faith tends to get transmitted is through relationships, right? Okay, so I mean, what do I mean by this? All right, well, let me talk a little bit about Rodney Stark and his friend William Bainbridge. Um, and they did I'm sorry, actually, that should be John Laughlin, not Bainbridge, it's Laughlin. John Laughlin, who did a pioneering study of a religious group called the Moonies, right? So the Moonies are this kind of odd group, right? They came from Korea. They have this kind of odd, so they came to the US from Korea. They have this odd kind of theology that says that, God has come back in the form of, someone in Korea. And that they are the new kind of, avatars of this faith. Okay, I mean, nothing inherently sort of wrong with that. It's a religious belief of sorts. Um, what happened in the 1960s is that Stark and Laughlin um, went and actually kind of hung out with the Moonies, right? And this really cool kind of study. One of the ones that where, honestly, Rodney Stark kind of made his bones hanging out with the Moonies in a really cool kind of task. So what happened? Um, well, they observed a curious pattern of how people essentially move into faith. And we've talked about this when we talked about the nuns as well. So what happened with Stark and Laughlin and the Moonies is that basically they went and hung out and kind of watched who joined the Moonies. And what they saw was that what's kind of primary in acquiring religious faith, and therefore what's kind of primary in maintaining religious faith, is relationship, right? So the people who converted to the Moonies were the people who formed really close interpersonal relationships. And Stark and Laughlin sort of thought of this as a balance, right? So it's like when their relationships inside the group, the Moonies, outweighed their relationships outside the group, that's when people converted. And it followed this pattern that I outlined when we talked about the nuns, right? Of those who actually, do acquire religion. They belong, right? The first of the three B's, they belong. They behave, so they start acting like religious people, and then they start to believe. Now, I mean, obviously this is going to be a little bit different in terms of parents passing on faith to their children. That's going to be a different process, but it still is centered on that belonging, right? People want to belong to their families. It's super important to people, right? For the most part, right? There's obviously exceptions where people don't get along with their families, but for the most part, we want to align with, what remains really our critical relationship, the one with our families. So, when it comes to passing on faith, it's much more about building relationships, especially between parent and child, and communicating the importance of faith through that relationship and with other adults in religious communities. Less so than, communicating, this is the story of Jesus, well, that is certainly important, or Muhammad, or the Buddha, or these are the teachings. Those are certainly important. But religion seems to work very much in this kind of communal setting more so than almost anything else. Okay, so yeah, people maintain or adopt belief based on their social ties. That's what's key, right? And in a culture that's very assimilative and where a lot of people don't have religious ties, like, where peers may not be religious, and certainly once you get into the realm of, say, romantic partners, right? Romantic partners may not be religious, and people will move their sort of levels of belief in a lot of cases in alignment with those things. So you need, very strong relations within the kind of, faith community so that balance doesn't ultimately get tipped, right? And that's, I'm making it sound very, mathematical, but in a sense it is, right? It's like if your relationships outside of kind of a religious context start to outweigh those within it, the likelihood that you're going to move, away from faith and into something like a religious indifferentism, being a nun, is much higher, right? That's kind of what it looks like. It's a slow drifting away, right? We talked about it again. We talked about the nuns. It's not like for most people, they just drop their beliefs, right? It's like, I don't believe this anymore. It's like a slow kind of wandering away. Those social ties get weaker and weaker, and they start to be outweighed more and more by social ties within the group. Without those, without that strong story, without that sense of who people are and how important that religious vocabulary is, right? Ultimately, faith doesn't last. Okay, so parents succeed when, people are what they practice, right? This is important. Young people are obviously very attuned to hypocrisy, right? So the key to parents who have highly religious youth is both modeling and invitation. Um, right. So, I mean, it involves things like attending religious services, doing religious things, doing religious acts of service, right? Praying, reading whatever holy book is holy to your family, right? Young people will, when they see their parents doing these things, they may imitate them at the end of the day, right? Okay, so when teens see their parents being religious and doing religious things, and they themselves imitate that behavior, right? So, they need a model. being religious is not inherent to people, right? It is modeled by other people, and it can be done effectively, and it can be done ineffectively, and it can be done not at all, right? But teens are not, broadly speaking, or anyone, going to come to religious beliefs on their own. It does not happen, right? Because that's not how human beings are, right? We are socialized, right? We are socialized by our communities. So teens see their parents being religious and doing religious things that they themselves imitate. That's when religion happens. And yeah, parents invite their children into their religious practices, right? So parents just doing their religious-y things on their own, that isn't going to work. They have to invite, they have to invite their children to practice. So, I mean, I think of this with, in a sense, like anything that you're going to do is a function of practice, right? And of going through the steps a lot of times, and a lot of times kind of ineffectively before you get really good at it, right? So my son is in Taekwondo. Um, and I mean, so I'm going to use Taekwondo as a religious metaphor, right? And he struggles a lot with, especially at the beginning of a new belt, with this sort of movement sets, right? With how you do kicks and how you do punches and how you do the kind of scripted actions that are required to get your belts in Taekwondo. And he has to practice, right? And he makes a lot of mistakes. And so, I mean, I sort of walk alongside him. I'm no Taekwondo expert. I just kind of observe what's going on and try to kind of correct him, right? And I watch him do the moves. I watch him, the teachers show him the moves, and then at home I try to correct him. But he's getting, thousands of reps of the same action. And, by rep number 1,000, he starts to get really good at it, right? The more reps you do, the better you get at stuff. There's really there's no two ways about it, right? And that's the same with religious practice. Seeing someone do it, right? Modeling, right? And that's what my kid's Taekwondo coach does, or sensei, or master, or I can't remember the term. He models, right? He shows you how to do the moves. Then you do them. You practice them, and you practice them, and you practice them. And then you practice them some more, right? And it's the same kind of essential thing with religious behavior. They don't come naturally, right? And I think we probably exist in a world where we think that religion is at least somewhat natural, or certainly a lot of religious people do, right? Because it's something that's been in society forever. And so we sort of expect that, religious action is going to be natural, right? The people just know. They don't need any instruction in it. They just know, right? We know how to be religious. Why? Because human beings are kind of religious. But it's by modeling, right? So you show what you're doing, right? Modeling and invitation, right? And it's like, okay, now you do it, right? Now you pray the rosary. Now you meditate. Now you, do the five daily prayers of Islam, right? Now you repeat passages from the Quran, right? Modeling and practice, right? It's. I mean, I've probably stressed it enough, and I will move on here. But I think it's really interesting, right, to think of religion in such a different kind of way, not as part of human nature, but as a set, I'm certainly open to the idea, and if I were to articulate it myself as a sociologist, I would say that human beings have religious potential. In almost the same way I'd say my son has the potential to do Taekwondo. Now, if he doesn't ever learn Taekwondo skills, right, that potential will go to waste. It will not develop. And it's the same thing. Humans have religious potential. We know this. Why? Because there are religious human beings, right? In all sorts of ways. So obviously it is there, and it can be activated given the right conditions. And so the job of parenting is creating those right conditions, right? And modeling and practicing all of the moves of religious faith. Yeah, so I mean, obviously a big part of Dean's kind of work in this chapter, and I really think it's super interesting, right? Um, is on translation and this idea of, you know, okay, the way she puts it, right? Catechesis, and again, she's thinking here not of a class in a church, though. I mean, if you grew up Catholic, you're definitely going to have this idea of catechesis as something like, you know, RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. Um, but she's thinking of it in a different way, right? She's thinking of this in this Martin Luther kind of way, right? Of happening in the home, right? And what is catechesis, right? For her, she says it translates Christian tradition, or this could be any religious community. It doesn't have to be Christian. She's just focused on Christianity because obviously she's a Presbyterian or a United Methodist, and she's Christian, and that's what she cares about, right? It translates Christian faith or any religious faith into lived faith and nurtures the conversations behind the wall that anchor religious identity, right? So it translates, right? It translates ideas into practice. That's what catechesis does, right? And it teaches those practices so that then you can do the moves of faith over and over and over and over and over again until it sticks. And this is any behavior, right? This is any human behavior. Faith is not fundamentally different in lots of ways from any other kind of social behavior that human beings have. Practice, 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 right? Trying, 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 trying. That's what makes it work. Um, yeah, it's what people have to do in religious communities and in families. And I think this is the best. This is the best sort of way to put it, right? The best translators are people, not programs. Right? I mean, just think of, right, you throw something into Google Translator, right? Versus, you know, someone who is a native speaker of Spanish and English, right? You're going to get a much better translation from that translator than from Google Translate. And I don't care how good AI gets, right? Maybe it'll get so good someday that it'll do better, you know, than a flesh and blood translator. Languages don't have equivalent meanings, right? The same words in language don't mean the same thing, right? And the idioms and such are incredibly hard to translate. People are better translators than programs, and this is true for faith as well, right? And here by programs now we don't mean computer programs, but like, you know, church or other religious community programs, right? Like, you know, something like the Alpha course or something like this, right? The best translators are bilingual, right? And this should probably be of concern to religious communities, right? Because how many adults speak faith, speak religious knowledge, right? If people don't, you know, if they've been insufficiently religiously socialized and they don't have the knowledge base, how do they themselves put that into practice? And if they've never had the practice, right? How do you do religious practices? How do you do religious practices if you've never done them, right? And so, I mean, I think here an implicit, certainly on the Christian side, an implicit criticism of the way people have thought of kind of how do you live religiously, right? I mean, I think here of particularly, you know, evangelical churches that I've been to, and I've been to many, right, of all sorts of different traditions, because I just have this kind of broad interest in seeing how people do religious life for obvious reasons, right? I am interested in what I'm interested in. That's why I'm teaching this class. And, you know, like if I think about evangelical churches, they're really good at communicating information, right? Yeah, you know, a lot of kind of informational transfer, right? Like 40-minute surveys where they go through some religious, you know, or some scriptural passage and beat it to death, you know, and communicate some truth that's in it. So, I mean, in a sense, like it's almost like Google Translates. You're translating some religious knowledge, you know, into people's lives, but it's just knowledge. Rather than practice, right? It's not lived, right? People haven't gone through the reps of knowing how do you even do something like pray, right? And I mean, I think of like my Roman Catholic friends as well. You know, a lot of like going through the motions, but little understanding. And without both of those things, right? You know, the tradition hasn't been translated into a lived faith in a lot of cases. It's just by rote. Um, and people don't understand what they're doing or why they're doing it, right? And with that low level of religious knowledge, how can people then transmit that on to the next generation? And this comes from Chris Smith, right? This kind of idea, and I like it. I like it a lot. I think it resonates with me. The second language of faith needs to be practiced like any other language. And yeah, either communities make opportunities for that to happen, or the language of faith withers and the practitioners get assimilated into the dominant culture, right? Because there's not enough there to keep them kind of solid at the end of the day. So I mean, that's it in a sense for Ken and Chrissy Dean for this. I mean, hopefully you kind of understand this idea of faith as bilingualism, right? Of a learned language and these practices as kind of reps, right? And things where, you know, effective religious parenting, what does it look like? Well, in a lot of cases, it looks like just practice, right? And giving young people a chance to practice and fall down and make mistakes and, you know, learn through like awkward recitation what, you know, it looks like to be a religious person.